The information in this presentation may contain forward-looking statements that are subject to risks and uncertainties, known and unknown, which may cause actual results to differ materially from the results discussed in the forward-looking statement. Further information on this is contained in Corcept's 10-K that can be accessed at the SEC or through the company website. It's Friday, May 24th, 2013, and I'm Alan Leong of Biotech Stock Research, and I'm in Menlo Park, California with Joe Belanoff, Chief Executive Officer of Corcept Therapeutics. The company is currently marketing Korlym to treat Cushing's syndrome. It also has Korlym in a phase 3 study for treating psychotic depression. It has a next-generation therapeutic in a phase 2 trial, and lastly, it has a large number of drug candidates that are being explored and vetted for the clinic. The company stock is traded on the NASDAQ under the ticker symbol CORT. Well, Joe, it's good to be here this morning.
Yeah, good morning.
Can you tell us some things about the status of the commercialization of Korlym? For example, the outreach strategy and how many marketing staff you have and how are they being deployed these days?
You know, as I'm sure all of your readers know, getting Korlym approved for Cushing's syndrome was, a critical milestone for the company. And we've been out now commercializing the drug for about a year. And we've really learned a great deal about moving the drug to the patients who really need it. So my overall comment is I'm very pleased about it, the status of the commercialization. I feel like metaphorically, the rock is really starting to move. We've really learned a lot about how to tell the story correctly, what facts are important to physicians, and how to get to those physicians. So I just want to point out a couple things because I know many of your readers have been following the company for a while. Recently, I think one of the things we've done quite well is figured out how to target the right physicians. We have now a much better sense of who's actually treating Cushing's syndrome patients. This was really an eye-opener that I'll explain in a minute. And where they are, which allows us to use our now kind of fully staffed sales force and medical science liaisons to get to the right doctors. An interesting thing that we found out was that although many patients with Cushing's syndrome go to major medical centers for their surgery, when their surgery is actually successful, that's great, they're done. But when their surgery actually unfortunately fails, and that's going to happen in about 50% of the patients, they then get treated by their local physician, and they don't return to the major academic centers. So one of the things we really had to figure out is, who in the community are treating these patients, because there are lots of them, and I think we have a much better sense of where that is right now. What we've also really found out is that because of this particular group of doctors and the fact that this is a medication with a new mechanism of action for them, one of the best communication strategies has been doctor to doctor. And, a really nice thing, probably the nicest thing about the whole story, is the medicine really works. It worked just as well for the commercial patients as it does in the study. So now we have a growing base of doctors who have successfully treated patients with Korlym, and many of them are quite willing to talk to other doctors to tell them about their own experience. And so I'm really hoping at this point, we're close to a tipping point where people realize that this is a medication that they can comfortably use once they understand its risks and benefits.
I know it's rather early in the game, but how's the reaction been from the prescribing physicians and from the Cushing's patient community?
I think that from the patients it's been terrific. I mean, there are some really just wonderful stories about people making great strides, as they did in our clinical trial. So it really is not a big surprise to me, but it's very nice to see. And I think that, again, this is a group of doctors who by nature is quite cautious. And we always viewed the single biggest hurdle as taking a doctor from 0 patients treated to 1 patient treated. Once they've treated 1 patient, and understand the medicine, a lot of their fears of inexperience really go away. So I'm hoping that really is building some momentum and feel like legitimately in our observations it has. Because we now have doctors who have prescribed the medicine 3-4 times. Now, what we'd really like to do is, again, continue to build first users, because we think that building first users is a way to build second, third, and fourth users.
We were on the Korlym website and we noticed Sarah's story with her symptoms involving weight gain, skin spots on her tummy area, and she apparently went through a medical journey in which she diagnosed herself after some time. How is this typical or atypical of the Cushing patient experience?
Well, unfortunately, it's pretty typical, and there's one kind of important scientific thing that I think your readers may be interested in, which is, unfortunately, there's a very wide range of what is perceived as normal in cortisol. It is and I can tell you what it is. If you, for instance, looked at the afternoon value of cortisol in Cecil's or Harrison's in one of the major textbooks, it would say, 4 to 15. Now imagine if I said to you, all right, Alan, well, your normal blood pressure is, 120 over 80 to 480 over 320. Like, that would sound bizarre, but that's kind of what it is with cortisol. Now, why this is important in this story, and specifically, I think Sarah, you'll hear about that, is that she knew that her Cushing's syndrome was returning even before it met the measurement that an endocrinologist would say to treating her, and that's very frustrating. Patient will say, I have it. The doctors say, I can't prove that you do, because they're solely looking at the lab test and not the manifestations of the excess cortisol. And that's very, very frustrating for patients. Even putting Sarah aside, if you go onto the websites for the Cushing Support Research Foundation, you will see many stories about patients that unfortunately kicked around in the system, sometimes for years, before they actually came to a diagnosis. And what we're really hoping is, with the attention we're drawing to the disease, that will get refined and patients will get treated earlier in their course, because sometimes they will develop residual effects that are difficult to reverse. And if they get treated earlier, it might be better. So I actually think that Sarah's story is quite typical.
Is there concern being raised on metrics like urinary free cortisol or other measures of cortisol levels, whether they're really giving an accurate picture of the disease in any one patient?
Well, that is really, I think, absolutely the correct and cutting-edge question. That level does not necessarily associate with clinical condition. And I think what people have always known, and endocrinologists just haven't known what to do with it, is someone can have quite high cortisol levels and have modest Cushing syndrome, and they can have modestly elevated Cushing syndrome, cortisol levels, and have terrible Cushing syndrome. So I think they've known for a long time that those things don't necessarily correlate. Endocrinologists as a group are doctors who are drawn to the fact that they like to measure things in the lab and so forth, but whether they clinically correlate is in fact the important question. For instance, patients could care less what their circulating cortisol level is. They want to know, are they fat? Are they fatigued? Can they think clearly? What's the actual effect of the cortisol? And I think why this is so important is that Korlym goes right to those effects. By blocking the effects of cortisol in all the various tissues of the body where it's in excess, they actually it reverses those symptoms. Whereas, changing cortisol level may not in fact get that clinical improvement done.
Almost points us and begs us to another area, which is the so-called subclinical Cushing's.
Yeah.
Maybe for our readers, you can explain what is it and how large is it? Because this can be pretty huge.
Well, first thing, I think subclinical Cushing syndrome is really a misnomer, right? It's if you have insulin insensitivity and diabetes, those are clinical conditions. Now, the fact that your cortisol levels may not be grossly elevated, doesn't mean you don't have a problem. So first, I think as an old English major, I think vocabulary counts for a lot. It's not subclinical. It's clinical, it's just not the way they're used to thinking about it. And, as you know, there was a recent publication, and just sort of quoting their numbers, there's a lot of people who have what are essentially adrenal adenomas, tumors of their adrenal gland, that produce clinical effects, even though they don't produce the florid Cushing's picture. They produce insulin resistance, they produce diabetes, and again, according to that article, there was at least 100,000 of those patients, separate from all the patients we're currently counting with Cushing syndrome. Now, what was interesting in that article, De Bono was the first author, was that they were very successfully treated with mifepristone. And it doesn't surprise me at all, because again, the way the drug works is where cortisol levels are in excess, it blocks that problem. And those patients improved, a great deal. So I don't know where it ultimately goes, but those are patients, for instance, who are covered by our label, as they should be. And there's no reason why the drug wouldn't work in those patients. I can tell you that since that article came out, we've received several proposals for additional study of those patients, and, we'll try to support that.
Would you suppose it would get its own diagnostic code or go under the other?
No, it really is Cushing syndrome.
Yeah.
I think a more accurate way to put it, although my own opinion is that no Cushing syndrome is mild, is it's more mild in the spectrum of Cushing syndrome. It is not subclinical, and it shouldn't be ignored.
The psychotic depression trial, which is actually where I initially came in on Corcept.
Yes.
Can you give us a quick overview of the trial, its current status and the anticipated milestones?
Well, it's in progress. Now, if you remember, because you have followed the story for a long time, we basically had to put it for financial reasons on the back burner while we were completing our Cushing syndrome program. And once the drug was approved, and you may remember we did a major fundraising last summer, we then sort of set the wheels in motion to reinvigorate the psychotic depression study and hopefully take that to the finish line too. And so I guess within the last maybe 4-6 weeks, we actually got up to our full set of study sites. We now have 23 study sites around the country enrolling patients for that study. And our goal is to complete enough enrollment by the end of this year to be able to take an interim look at the data. Actually, we don't take it, a DSMB does, and have them, fingers crossed, return with the answer that the study has met its primary endpoint and we can stop. And so it is, commercialization of Korlym is a high priority, obviously. It's what produces our revenues, but finishing the psychotic depression is an extremely high priority too, and we're really out on the road a lot now, making sure that study gets done correctly.
Now, are we looking at this occurring around the turn of the year or early
The
next
goal
year?
is to actually have enough patients in by the turn of the year to have a successful interim analysis, which would be announced approximately the end of the first quarter of next year. We haven't set, because we're actually really still doing the statistical work, where's the best place to do that interim analysis, and for the people who are really sophisticated, exactly how much p-value to use. But it's in progress, and we will have this answer soon, and as soon as we do, we'll announce it publicly.
We noticed that there's some recent publications detailing a number of interesting things about Court 108297. Are you studying it as an example, or are you now seeing it as a rather unique compound in your library?
Well, to your credit, Alan, you have really followed the story with a lot more interest than I think many others, and I think part of it is because, you do take the longer view. The reason I point that out is, while these compounds don't add a lot of value to Corcept's share price at the current time, they're the future of the company, and we think they're very, very, very important, going forward. We probably in fact, let me just for your readers kind of tell the whole story, which was that Korlym, mifepristone, is a terrific compound, but as you know, it's a progesterone receptor antagonist. It causes early termination of pregnancy, and mostly for political reasons, it limits its use to kind of special populations. Cushing syndrome is a relatively small population, an orphan disease. Psychotic depression is not a small population, but it's often treated in the hospital, and we treat it briefly. So there it's found acceptance, at least conceptually. For some of the larger disorders where we think that GR2 antagonism might be useful, diabetes, obesity, early Alzheimer's disease, oncological illnesses, it's just a difficult sell that this will show up in many, many people's medicine cabinets. So about 4 or 5 years ago, we started working on seeing if we could come up with compounds which block cortisol and didn't block progesterone. And it was a real medicinal chemistry feat. I think we counted 15 other companies had tried before we did, and we were the first to succeed. And I really, credit a group who, working for us who got that right. But here's the interesting thing. Although none of our compounds block progesterone, they're not identical to each other. That's the interesting thing about science. Some are better at getting in the brain, some are better at insulin sensitivity, some are better at creating weight loss, some are more active in oncologic models. So even though they share in common that they block the GR2 receptor and don't block progesterone, that they have some differences. So now back to your question. 108297, which is the first compound we brought into man, has turned out to be a very interesting compound, and I know at least one of the articles you're alluding to, which one was recently published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science Journal. It turns out to be a compound that is a GR2 antagonist, like mifepristone in some tissues, but an agonist in other tissues. It's very active centrally, and so there may be psychiatric illnesses where it is really ideal. It's the ideal drug for treatment. And as you picked up a while ago, that's an unusual set of characteristics. and we're really thinking about where to best deploy it. So in some ways, it's an example. It's a nice clinical probe. We can test other things, but what we already understand is that it has qualities which separate it from some of our other compounds. For instance, we have some compounds that in at least preclinical testing really look identical to mifepristone, and some that look closer to 108-297 and some that are in the middle of it. And as we bring this library forward, our goal is to have compounds, individual compounds for 4 or 5 different disorders where they fit best. So still finding that out, again, for your readers, on the one side, maybe all this will amount to nothing. That happens. But we're really very hopeful that it's going to amount to a big deal. And I think we have increasing reasons to think that that's the case.
I'd like to go back to an earlier issue.
Yeah.
It has to do with Korlym for being treated on Cushing's disease.
Yeah.
And there has been some discussion out there about Korlym producing adrenal insufficiency and electrolyte imbalance, and if I may quote, 2 serious side effects.
Yeah.
Did you have any color you could provide on that?
Yeah, I think this is a very important thing to understand, and it's something that we've had to explain to doctors who really aren't familiar with the mechanism. So I'll explain it to you, and if you have questions, let me go from there. So I think what people sometimes forget is that there are 2 receptors in the body for cortisol. For endocrinologists, they're called MR and GR. They're always the same set. Some people call them type 1 and type 2. Psychiatrists tend to call them GR1 and GR2. Endocrinologists call them MR and GR, but they're the same 2 receptors. And MR is actually, in most tissues of the body, the actual more avid receptor for cortisol. So cortisol gets into it quite easily. It takes care of homeostasis. And GR, which is what Korlym blocks, is not activated till cortisol levels are high. So 2 things to think about. The first is, 1, Korlym only blocks one of the receptors. Now here's why this is important. I think what people are used to thinking about with adrenal insufficiency is the situation where, for instance, if you gave someone an adrenalectomy, and then the cortisol level just goes to 0, and neither of the receptors are getting activated. Or a drug which actually prevents the production of cortisol, like ketoconazole. Potentially, if you were successful enough with it, you could make cortisol levels go to 0, and neither receptor would be activated. With Korlym, only one of the receptors has blockade. The MR receptor is not touched at all. It's quite activated. In fact, sometimes it's more activated because it's Cushing syndrome, so there's a lot of cortisol floating around. So the symptom that physicians are afraid of with adrenal insufficiency is someone will drop their blood pressure and potentially have a fatality. Well, as a result of activating the MR receptor with cortisol, that doesn't happen. We've never seen a single case of hypotension with Korlym if people were not already taking other antihypertensive medications. In fact, one of the things that we really caution people about is saying, look, you may not need to give antihypertensive medications with Korlym. You can take that away. I mean, that's a benefit to your patient. They don't need to use that anymore. And so it really is a very different setting than what endocrinologists are used to thinking of as adrenal. So mechanistically, it's important to understand. The other important thing to understand is that Korlym is a competitive antagonist of the GR receptor, which means it doesn't destroy the GR receptor. It just stochastically, sometimes it's in the receptor, sometimes cortisol in the receptor. Clearly, it has a lot of benefit by dialing down the activity, but unlike something like, say, botulinum toxin, the way you reduce activity with Korlym is you just stop giving Korlym, and then cortisol gets back into that receptor. Or if you wanted to reverse it immediately, you could do so just by giving a synthetic agonist like dexamethasone or prednisone. So I think when doctors really understand that and they really look at the data and they understand, well, there's no reason why you'd expect to get adrenal insufficiency, that issue goes away. And I think it really just comes back to understanding the mechanism of how the drug works. Now, to your second question, because the cortisol is activating MR in Cushing syndrome, activating MR makes the body lose potassium. It has nothing to do with Korlym. It's just what happens in Cushing's syndrome. And in fact, our drug does not block MR. It does not solve that problem. So patients actually do need to continue to take or have to be monitored, as they currently are, their potassium level and get potassium replacement. In fact, Korlym, by blocking the feedback mechanism, actually can increase the amount of circulating cortisol, putting more cortisol into the MR. Again, supporting blood pressure, which is what people worry about, but potentially causing potassium levels to be lower. Now, fortunately, that's a pretty easy thing to monitor and to treat, and we really advise people to do that. For instance, I can tell you in our clinical study, the single biggest group of patients who needed potassium replacement were the patients who needed to be replaced before the study began, because we made everyone be normalized before the study entry. So these people are walking around like that, and it really does need to be attended to whether or not they get Korlym.
In an earlier discussion, you mentioned that a next generation drug will get developed for treating Cushing's syndrome.
Yes, it's certainly one of our targets.
Have other indications been chosen yet?
Yeah, good question. Well, of course, psychotic depression. Right. We're treating mifepristone. We've discussed that. And the answer is not so far. I mean, we're still really fleshing out. We only have one compound in the clinic and many compounds that are now candidates for the clinic. And we're really trying to figure out how they work. Now, what we don't want people to do is get ahead on themselves. We don't know where each of these compounds are going to go. But the flip side of that is this is an area of academic research that has mushroomed in the last decade. For instance, there are now multiple publications on the use of GR antagonists in very serious cancers, like triple-negative breast cancer or ovarian cancer. And this is not Corcept research. I mean, this is research being done out in the world. So I have hope, I don't have proof, but I have hope that some of our compounds might be real breakthrough medications in area of diseases like that. There's also been, as you know, there's now a study being sponsored by the VA in post-traumatic stress disorder. There's been both preclinical and clinical publications on the use of medications with this mechanism in treating alcohol withdrawal and alcoholism. And so I'm really hopeful that we'll be able to pick the best fit for our compounds and develop in that area, but it hasn't been chosen yet.
I saw the publication on alcohol withdrawal.
Yeah, that was a fascinating one.
Yeah, actually, it was almost startling because they talked about wet dog shakes.
Yeah.
That's a very gross behavior, and something you normally don't see. Can you provide some color? Why would an antagonist even help to treat withdrawal?
It's very stressful to withdraw.
Yeah.
Very stressful. And so the way it actually treats it, and so what it does is when people are stressed and they feel bad and they withdraw, what do? They drink. And if you can really limit that portion of it, they are much more likely to be able to cut down or stop drinking. And so that's really the effect. Another interesting thing, and there have been several publications about that, is withdrawal itself actually causes cognitive problems. And if you can avoid that, that's also helpful in helping people reduce their drinking or stop entirely. So it's a very interesting thing. I think one of the things you probably were not aware of is that the first human study was actually presented as an oral presentation at the American College of Neuropharmacology's meeting in December. Barbara Mason was the lead investigator at Scripps, and the animal data really translated to people. So she's now in the process of getting a larger government grant to study a lot of patients, and we'll provide the medicine for her as well. So what's interesting, again, to your readers is the whole world is now looking at Corcept as Korlym for Cushing's syndrome. And Korlym for Cushing's syndrome is important. Bad disease, drug really works, but we're not looking at it that way at all. We're really looking at this as a platform of medications of which we're very far ahead of others, and the science is really beginning to support it in big ways. So can't promise results soon, but for those of you who, your readers who have kind of a longer time horizon, I think there's a very exciting future.
There's a number of drugs from Corcept that are in the hands of the independent investigators right now. Yeah, many. Some of them must be tempted to enter the clinic with it. Who's going to do the phase 1 trials? Will it be them sometimes?
No, I mean, actually, just for keeping all the intellectual property with us, it will be us. So you're actually, let me just ask your question in a different way. At some point here, we have to return these compounds to Corcept so that we can push them ahead more quickly. And which ones and for which disorders is an act that gets discussed every single day, but the decisions haven't been made yet. But eventually they have to be brought back in-house, even as independent investigators work on them. And as you know, I'm kind of a recovering academic, so I'm very glad to support all these investigations, very interesting, but ultimately we have to do it.
Is there anything else you'd like to say to our client?
No, it's a very exciting time. I mean, I think you can't really tell that by the lack of volatility in the stock price. We kind of just stay there. But we're very excited where things are. We've worked very hard to this point, and we're really hoping that the results will be more and more visible with each quarter.
Joe, thank you very much.
Yeah, it's great to talk to you.